Welcome to our horror community, Adam's Scary Stories. If you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe now, so you don't miss out. Are you ready to hear the stories that won't let you sleep? Then turn down the lights, put on your headphones, and join us on this dark journey. The light in Alaska during the summer is a thief. It steals the night, leaving you in a perpetual golden twilight that messes with your head. It was nearly 11 p.m. and I was sitting on the banks of the Copper River, but the sun hung in the sky like a stubborn guest who refuses to leave a party. It painted the landscape in hues of pale gold and soft pink, making the distant snow-capped peaks of the Wrangell Mountains glow. This was my ritual, a solo trip deep into the Alaskan bush every July. I wasn't a tourist. I was a pilgrim seeking refuge from the concrete grid of city life. My spot was a small grassy clearing on a bend in the river, a place you couldn't find on any map. Getting here required 2 days of navigating by topo map and compass, a skill I was proud of. It was a place where you were more likely to encounter a grizzly than another human being. That was the whole point. My setup was meticulous. My Hilleberg tent, a fortress against the notorious Alaskan winds, was staked down tight. All my food and anything with a scent was locked in a bear-resistant canister stashed 100 yards away from my camp, rule number 1 in the backcountry. My gear was top of the line, but my most prized possession was a brand new satellite phone. It was my lifeline, a silent promise of rescue in a land that offered none. I was grilling a freshly caught salmon over a small, crackling fire, the smell of wood smoke, the crisp, cool air, and the rhythmic murmur of the river. This was the peace I had craved for months. Leaning back in my camp chair with a mug of hot coffee, I let the profound silence of the wilderness wash over me. That's when I saw them. 2 figures emerged from the dense spruce forest downriver, walking along the gravelly bank directly toward me. In this immense solitude, the sight of other people was a jolt, a disruption of the natural order. My heart hammered against my ribs, not from fear, but from pure, unadulterated surprise. "Evening," the man called out as they approached the edge of my camp. He had a thick beard and a pair of piercing blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Hope we didn't startle you. Didn't figure we'd see another soul out this far." I rose from my chair in instinctive defensive posture. "No worries. The fire's for everyone. Come on, warm up." They introduced themselves as Mark and Lena. They were disarmingly friendly, spinning a tale about being photographers drawn to the raw beauty of the Alaskan interior. We fell into the easy rhythm of camp talk. Trails, weather, the sheer scale of the landscape. But as we spoke, I noticed something unsettling. Mark's gaze kept drifting over my gear. Wasn't the idle curiosity of a fellow camper. It was an appraisal, a quiet inventory. He clocked the brand of my tent, the model of my expensive hiking boots, and then his eyes landed on the satellite phone I had placed on a flat rock to get a clear signal. "Wow. Now that's a serious piece of kit," he said, his voice laced with an admiration that felt a little too sharp. "No cell service for 100 miles. That thing's a lifesaver." "That's the idea," I replied curtly, picking up the phone and slipping it into the zippered inner pocket of my jacket. For a split second, a flicker of something, annoyance, disappointment, crossed Mark's face before being replaced by his easy smile. Lena laughed, a sound that seemed a bit too loud in the quiet expanse. "Don't mind Mark, he's a gearhead. We're old school, just a map and compass for us." Her comment struck me as odd. Navigating this terrain without a reliable GPS or satellite messenger wasn't old school. It was reckless. After we finished the salmon I offered them, I asked where their camp was. "Oh, just up the way, across the river," Mark said, gesturing vaguely. "We travel light. Ultralight, you know. No tent, just a tarp and our bags." An alarm bell, faint but clear, went off in my head. The nights here, even in summer, could drop below freezing. Going without a proper tent was a gamble I wouldn't take, and I doubted any experienced outdoorsman would either. A little while later, I stood up. I'm going to refill my water bottles. I grabbed my filter and walked the few yards to the river's edge, turning my back on them. It was a mistake I would regret for the rest of my life. When I returned, they were already on their feet, ready to leave. "Thanks again for the hospitality and the amazing fish," Mark said, his smile wider now. "By the way, there's an old abandoned gold mine about a mile north of here. Incredibly cool spot. We're heading there in the morning if you want to join." My internal alarms were now screaming. An abandoned mine with these two strangers? Not a chance. "Thanks for the offer, but I'm planning to head out early down south," I lied, deliberately pointing in the opposite direction. "All right then. Maybe we'll cross paths again," Lena said. They turned and melted back into the trees they had come from. I watched them go, letting out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. But the relief was short-lived, replaced by a gnawing unease. On instinct, I reached into my jacket to feel the reassuring shape of my phone. The pocket was empty, my blood ran cold. I frantically patted down my jacket, then my pants. Nothing. I searched the ground around my chair, inside the tent, everywhere. The phone was gone. It had vanished so cleanly, so silently, that for a terrifying moment I wondered if I had imagined bringing it. But I knew I hadn't. I remembered the solid weight of it in my hand just before I put it away. They were thieves, and I had invited them into my camp, served them my food, and let them walk away with my only connection to the outside world. A wave of pure, cold fear washed over me. I kicked dirt over the fire, extinguishing its comforting glow. The light and warmth that had felt like a sanctuary now felt like a spotlight, exposing me. I scrambled into my tent and zipped it shut, the thin nylon wall feeling as useless as paper. The sun continued its slow, lazy arc across the sky. The perpetual daylight was no longer beautiful. It was a curse. In darkness I could have hidden. In this endless, shadowless twilight I was completely exposed. Then I heard it, a voice carried on the wind. It was Mark. He was somewhere in the trees, not far from my camp, talking on my satellite phone. The signal was choppy, but the words that reached me were clear enough to freeze my soul. "Yeah, we got it. Brand new model. He's alone. All top shelf gear. I'm sending the coordinates now. Yeah, on the river bend. Get here by morning." He was calling for backup. They weren't just petty thieves. They were predators who had found isolated prey, and now they were summoning the rest of the pack. I risked a peek through a small gap in the tent's zipper. They were standing at the edge of the woods watching my tent. The friendly masks were gone. Their faces were cold, calculating. They knew I had heard them. Their silent, steady gaze was a question and a threat. "What are you going to do now?" There was nowhere to run. Miles of unforgiving wilderness in every direction, a frigid, fast-moving river. And now, two, soon to be more, people who were infinitely more dangerous than any bear. I gripped the handle of the large hunting knife in my pack, but I knew it was a futile gesture. I sat there all night, a prisoner in my own tent, waiting for the inevitable. The couple didn't sleep. They rebuilt the fire, their laughter echoing across the valley, a sound of pure menace. They were waiting for morning, for their friends, for me to make a move. The sun crept higher, signaling the start of a new day that felt like the end of my world. And then I heard it, the distant, angry buzz of a motorboat fighting its way upriver. My time was up. The couple stood and walked toward the riverbank to greet their arrivals. I knew I had only seconds. In a final, desperate act, I took my knife and slashed open the back wall of my tent. I scrambled out and bolted into the forest, away from the river. I didn't know where I was going. I just ran. I ran from them, from the sound of the approaching boat, from the endless watching sun. Behind me I heard shouts, but I didn't look back. I knew my chances of survival in the wild were slim, but it was better than the certainty of what awaited me back at the camp. For days I stumbled through the wilderness, living on berries and sheer will, until, by a stroke of impossible luck, a park ranger on patrol found me, half dead from exposure and starvation. I survived, but a part of me never left that riverbank. It's still there, trapped in the unending daylight of that Alaskan summer night. The friendly smiles, the cold eyes, and the voice on my own phone sealing my fate. I learned that summer that the most dangerous predators in the wild don't always have claws and fangs. Sometimes they have a smile and a friendly voice, and they arrive as guests under the midnight sun. The November morning was a liar. When I unlatched the door of my cabin, the sky was a crisp, piercing blue, and the low-hanging sun made the fresh dusting of snow glitter like a carpet of diamonds. The air had a sharp, clean bite that made your lungs feel alive. It was a perfect day for tracking. I'd lived in this stretch of the Alaskan interior for 40 years. I'd learned to read the moods of the weather, or so I thought. My name is Ethan, and I'm a trapper. My life is etched into these forests, mountains, and frozen plains. My cabin, which I built with my own hands, sits 50 miles from the nearest anything, nestled on the shore of a frozen lake. My only neighbor here is the wilderness itself. That day I grabbed my rifle, my snowshoes, and a small pack with survival essentials. My plan was to head toward the nearby ridge where I'd seen signs of a large bull moose the week before. I figured I'd be back by noon. That was my first and most critical mistake. As I moved farther from the cabin, I felt the air shift. A thick, bruised-looking bank of clouds was rolling in fast from the west. I dismissed it, thinking it was just a passing squall. But in Alaska, nothing is ever just anything. Within an hour, the sky was a solid sheet of slate gray, and the wind had turned into a howling gale, carrying not flakes but needles of ice that stung my exposed skin. Soon I was caught in a full-blown whiteout. The wind shrieked, bending the ancient spruce trees until they groaned. The snow was so dense I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. My own tracks were vanishing the instant I made them. I knew I was lost. Trying to find the cabin in this was suicide. There was only one option: build a shelter and wait it out. I found a dense copse of evergreens that offered a slight break from the wind's fury. I started digging into a deep snowdrift at the base of the trees, carving out a makeshift snow cave. It wasn't a proper quinsy, just a hole to crawl into, but it would shield me from the wind. The work kept my body warm, but I knew the moment I stopped, the brutal Alaskan cold would begin its assault. After what felt like hours, I had a cramped space I could just barely fit inside. I pulled a small tarp from my pack to create a roof and then scoured the base of a fallen log for dry kindling, a near impossible task. With numb, trembling hands, I managed to coax a small flame to life. The tiny, flickering fire was a beacon of life in that swirling white hell. I huddled by the fire, my rifle across my lap. I unhooked my large hunting knife from my belt and placed it on the ground beside me. It was my grandfather's knife, with a handle carved from caribou antler and a blade so sharp you could shave with it. It was more than a tool to me, it was a companion. The blizzard intensified. The wind howled like a starving wolf. I gnawed on a piece of jerky from my pack, trying to force down calories. My eyelids were heavy, but I knew that sleep was a death sentence. If I drifted off in this cold, I would never wake up. That's when I saw it. Through the swirling curtain of snow, illuminated by the unsteady glow of my fire, a figure appeared. It was tall and unnervingly thin. It moved slowly, deliberately toward me. My heart seized in my chest. Another person out here in this storm? It was impossible. The figure stopped at the edge of my small clearing. The most terrifying thing was its attire. It wore only a thin, tattered shirt and worn-out jeans. Its feet were bare, sunk deep into the snow. Its hair was long and matted, and its skin had a bluish, almost translucent quality from the cold. No human could survive for more than a few minutes dressed like that. Yet it stood as if the sub-zero temperature was nothing more than a mild breeze. Its eyes, God, its eyes. They were dark, hollow pits like two extinguished coals. But deep within them a hunger burned, a ravenous, desperate hunger unlike anything I had ever seen in a man. I tightened my grip on my rifle. "Who are you?" I yelled, my voice nearly swallowed by the wind. It didn't answer. It simply raised one long skeletal hand and pointed a finger toward the fire. The gesture was slow, unnatural. It was asking for permission to approach. A primal part of me screamed to shoot, to drive it away. But my humanity, my years of solitude, held me back. What if it was just another lost soul, delirious from the cold? "Come on," I said, my voice raspy with hesitation. It glided forward and settled on the opposite side of the fire. It remained utterly silent. It didn't introduce itself or explain its presence. It just sat there, extending its long, thin hands toward the flames as if trying to absorb not their warmth, but their very essence. I tried to speak to it several times, but it never responded. It never even looked at me. Its gaze was fixed on one thing and one thing only: my knife, lying on the ground next to me. It stared at the polished steel blade with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The hunger in its eyes seemed to sharpen, to focus. The hours dragged on. The storm raged without end. We sat in silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the shriek of the wind. Its presence created a palpable cold that had nothing to do with the temperature, a cold that seeped into my bones, into my soul. My eyes burned with exhaustion. I fought to stay awake, but hours of physical exertion and mental stress were taking their toll. I let my eyelids close just for a second. When I opened them, it was gone. The space across the fire was empty. For a moment, I felt a wave of relief, thinking it had all been a hallucination, a fever dream brought on by the cold. Then my eyes fell to the ground beside me. My knife was gone. A new, more profound terror gripped me. It hadn't been a dream. It was real. And it had stolen my knife, but why? Who would risk their life in a blizzard for a simple blade? I scrambled out of my shelter. The storm had begun to subside and visibility was improving. Leading away from my camp was a set of tracks. But they were not human tracks. They were long, narrow, and misshapen. Where the toes should have been, there were claw-like impressions dug deep into the snow. And most horrifyingly, every few feet there was a thin, dragging line in the snow, as if from a long, whip-like tail. The tracks led straight into the darkest part of the forest, where no sane person would go. That's when the stories my grandfather told me came rushing back. He had spent time with the local Gwich'in people, and they spoke of an ancient, terrifying spirit of the north, the wendigo. A creature that was once human but was transformed by hunger and greed into an eternal, tormented monster. A being cursed with an insatiable appetite for human flesh. They said it hunted in the cold and the blizzards, and that its presence brought with it an unnatural chill. And they also said it was drawn to shiny things, especially sharp, glittering blades. My blood turned to ice. That man, that thing. It hadn't stolen my knife because it needed a tool. It had taken it because it was mesmerized by its gleam, by its sharpness. It was hungry, and I had been its intended meal. I abandoned my shelter, grabbed my pack, and ran in the opposite direction. I didn't look back. I just ran, my lungs burning, my legs screaming until I could run no more. I don't know how long I ran. When the storm finally broke, I found myself on a familiar ridge. From there in the distance, I could see a thin plume of smoke rising from the chimney of my cabin. I was safe. I barricaded myself in my cabin for days. I nailed extra boards over the windows and the door. Every night when the wind howled, I imagined I could hear something circling my cabin, the sound of claws scraping on frozen snow. I still live in these woods, but something has changed in me. I never go out when a storm is brewing, and I always carry 2 knives. One for my work and one just in case. Sometimes when I sit by my fire at night, I feel a pair of hungry eyes watching me from the darkness of the forest. And I live with the constant chilling fear that one day the shadow will emerge from the blizzard again, not to return my knife, but to claim what it truly came for. For my son Liam's 10th birthday, I decided to give him something no toy or gadget could ever match. A taste of the real, untamed Alaska. I'm an IT consultant, my life a structured grid of screens, lines of code, and endless virtual meetings. But I grew up in Alaska, and a part of my soul will always belong to its vast open spaces. I wanted Liam to feel that magic, the silence that's louder than any city noise, and a sky so immense it forces you to remember how small you are. We planned a trip to the edge of the gates of the Arctic National Park. This isn't a park in the conventional sense. There are no roads, no trails, no visitor centers. It's just pure, primordial wilderness. We chartered a small bush plane that dropped us on the shore of a remote, unnamed lake, with the pilot's promise to return for us in 3 days. As the drone of the plane's engine faded into the immense quiet, a profound silence settled over us. It was a living silence, one that had weight and texture. We were 2 tiny specks in an ocean of tundra. All around us, the landscape rolled away for miles, a carpet of moss, dwarf shrubs, and the vibrant, fleeting colors of Arctic wildflowers. In the distance, jagged gray peaks clawed at the sky. Liam's eyes were wide with wonder. "Dad, it's like another planet." "It's our planet, son," I smiled. "Just the part we've forgotten." The first day was perfect. We set up our tent on the lakeshore facing east to watch the midnight sun dip behind the mountains and rise again in a seamless twilight loop. We hiked the low rolling hills, spotted a distant herd of caribou, and I taught Liam how to filter the achingly cold, clear water from a stream. He was a sponge, his questions endless, his excitement infectious. That night, as we lay tucked in our sleeping bags, the world outside bathed in an ethereal, perpetual glow, Liam asked, "Dad, are there ghosts out here?" I chuckled. "No, buddy, just stories. And they're more powerful than any ghost." I had no idea how true that statement would prove to be. I woke before dawn the next morning. A strange, pearlescent light lay over the tundra, and a thin veil of mist was drifting across the lake. I unzipped the tent fly to breathe in the crisp air, and that's when I saw him. Sitting on a large, flat rock near the dead ashes of our campfire was an old man. My heart stopped. He was sitting there with a stillness that felt ancient, as if he were a part of the landscape itself. He was dressed in traditional attire, a caribou hide parka with the fur-lined hood pushed back and sealskin mukluks. His face was a deep, intricate map of wrinkles, each line telling a story I could never hope to read. His long, white hair was tied back in 2 simple braids. But the most unsettling thing was what he didn't have. No pack, no tent, no water bottle, no gear of any kind. He was just there. In the middle of this vast, unforgiving wilderness, he sat as if he were in his own living room. How had he gotten here? And when? I hadn't heard a sound. He wasn't looking at me. His gaze was fixed on the lake, where the mist swirled in slow, hypnotic patterns. He was as motionless as the rock he sat on. Liam was still sound asleep behind me. Carefully, silently, I slipped out of the tent. I had my hunting knife in my hand, though I had no idea what I would do with it. I stopped a few feet away from him. "Good morning," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He turned his head slowly. His eyes were dark and ancient, like two river stones polished smooth by centuries of flowing water. There was no fear in them, no surprise, no hostility. "Good morning?" His voice was a dry rustle, like autumn leaves skittering across stone. "I didn't hear you approach," I said, a statement that was also a question. He studied me for a long moment, as if weighing not my words, but my intent. Then he spoke. "You are sleeping on sacred ground." The words were simple, but they landed with a profound weight. "Sacred ground?" I asked, my voice faltering. "I'm sorry, I didn't know. There weren't any signs." "The signs are in the stones and the wind, not on posts of wood," he replied. "This is where the spirits of my ancestors walk. They come here when the sun is low to remember." A chill that had nothing to do with the morning air crept down my spine. This didn't feel like the ramblings of a crazy old man. It felt like a statement of fact, a truth I had blindly stumbled into. "We're sorry to have disturbed them," I said, my apology genuine. "We'll pack up and leave this spot today." He gave a slow, deliberate nod as if accepting my answer. Then he rose. His movements were fluid and silent. He turned and walked toward the mist that hovered over the lake. Within a few steps, he was swallowed by the white veil, vanishing as if he had never been there at all. I stood frozen, my heart pounding. When Liam woke up, he saw the look on my face. "What's wrong, Dad?" "Nothing. Just met a local hunter," I said, trying to sound casual. I didn't want to frighten him. We packed our gear quickly. As I was rolling up Liam's sleeping bag, I felt something hard underneath it. I picked it up. It was a small, perfectly smooth white stone with the faint fossilized impression of a bird's feather on its surface. It wasn't ours. "Where did this come from?" I asked Liam. He shrugged. "I've never seen it before." I put it in my pocket, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach. We moved our camp 2 miles down the lakeshore. All day I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I turned around, I saw nothing but the empty, rolling tundra. But the feeling was so intense it made the hair on my arms stand up. Liam felt it too. "Dad," he whispered later that afternoon, "it feels like we're not alone." That night, sleep was a restless, shallow affair. I was jolted awake around midnight by a strange sound. It was like a whisper on the wind, the words indistinct but the cadence ancient and sorrowful. I peered out of the tent, but there was nothing there. The next morning, as we were making breakfast, Liam let out a yelp. He was pointing at his backpack. Tucked into the outside mesh pocket, which had been empty the night before, was a small, tightly bound bundle of caribou hair and a single glossy black raven's feather. Now real fear began to take root. Where were these things coming from? The old man, or something else, was getting close enough to touch our belongings without us ever knowing. These didn't feel like gifts. They felt like markers, reminders of an unseen presence. Our last day was agony. Every shadow seemed to hold a figure. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. We stayed close to our new camp, waiting, constantly scanning the mercilessly empty sky for the plane. In the afternoon, I went to the lake to get water. In the soft mud at the edge, I saw a set of tracks. They were the prints of the old man's mukluks. They circled our new campsite over and over again like a sentry patrolling his post. When I finally heard the distant drone of the bush plane, I had never felt such overwhelming relief. We scrambled aboard. As the plane lifted off the ground, I looked down at the vast tundra. And then I saw him again. He was standing at our original campsite by the flat rock. He was not alone. Standing beside him were other figures, hazy and translucent, as if made of mist and memory. They were all looking up at us. The pilot must have seen the horror on my face. "Everything okay back there?" he asked over the headset. "Look down!" I yelled, my voice cracking. He banked the plane and looked. He was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice low and serious. "I told you this place was old. Some places you're not supposed to go. The native elders, the Gwich'in, they say the land here is alive. It remembers its visitors." When we got back to civilization, I emptied my pack. The white stone and the bundle of hair and feathers were still there. I thought about throwing them away, but I couldn't. They felt like a part of me now. Years have passed. Liam is a young man, but neither of us has ever forgotten that trip. Sometimes late at night, I look out my window at the suburban darkness and I can almost see the old man's face. I remember his words. "You are sleeping on sacred ground." I learned then that some places aren't on any map. They exist on a different plane, a map of spirits. And if you cross their boundaries uninvited, they leave a mark on you, a small stone, a raven's feather, a memory that you can never ever erase. The silent watcher is still out there, guarding that tundra, and I know that his ancient eyes are still watching me. My name is Maya. I'm a wildlife biologist. My life has been dedicated to the study and preservation of wild animals in their natural habitats. I've spent time in some of the most remote corners of the world, but the vast, brutal expanse of Denali National Park in Alaska has always called to me. It's a place where nature exists in its purest and most unforgiving form. That August, I was solo camping just outside the park's official boundary, in a territory known for its significant wolf population. My objective was to study the behavior of a specific pack I had been tracking for the past 2 years. I chose a small, open valley that offered a wide vantage point, allowing me to observe animal movements from a distance without being intrusive. I set up my base camp on a low ridge overlooking the valley. It was a minimalist setup: a small, sturdy tent, my sleeping bag, and my research equipment: high-powered binoculars, a field journal, and a camera with a telephoto lens. I stored my food in a bear canister far from my tent and decided against a fire. I wanted to keep my presence as low impact as possible. The first 2 days were peaceful and productive. I observed the wolf pack from afar, documenting their hunting patterns and their complex social dynamics. I felt a profound sense of privilege watching these magnificent creatures in their element. On the evening of the 3rd day, as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet, I was scanning the valley floor with my binoculars when I saw them. 3 human figures emerged from the far side of the valley. They walked slowly with a strange, synchronized rhythm and came to a stop by a creek bed about 200 yards from my camp. Puzzled, I focused my binoculars on them. They appeared to be 3 men, but their clothing was odd. They wore dark, heavy garments that didn't seem to belong to any particular era or culture. Most unnervingly, they carried no gear, no backpacks, no tents, no visible supplies of any kind. They sat down by the creek, spaced evenly apart, and simply stared out across the valley. They were perfectly still, like 3 granite statues. I tried to rationalize their presence. Perhaps they were local hunters or fellow researchers. I attempted to ignore them and focus on my work, but my eyes kept being drawn back to them. They did nothing. They didn't speak to each other. They didn't build a fire. They didn't set up any form of shelter. They just sat there, silent and motionless. As darkness deepened, a profound unease settled over me. Their silence was unnatural. In the Alaskan wilderness, silence is a powerful living thing, but their silence was different. It was heavy, oppressive, and vaguely threatening. That night, I lay in my tent, every nerve on high alert. Around midnight, I heard the sound of wolves howling. But this wasn't the distant, mournful call I was used to. This was close. It was a deep, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very ground, making the fabric of my tent tremble. I've heard wolves hundreds of times in my life, but this was different. It was aggressive, a territorial claim that I had never experienced so directly. Mustering my courage, I peered through the small mesh window of my tent. In the pale moonlight, I saw 3 shadows circling my camp. They were huge, larger than any wolf I had ever seen, and their eyes glowed like green embers in the dark. They moved in perfect silent unison. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, they melted back into the darkness. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The next morning, as the first light crept over the mountains, I cautiously exited the tent. My first instinct was to look toward the spot where the 3 men had been sitting. The space was empty. I raised my binoculars and scanned the area meticulously. There was no sign of human presence. No footprints, no matted grass, nothing. It was as if they had never been there. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it all, a product of exhaustion and isolation. I began to pack my gear, deciding it was time to leave. My research no longer felt important. My primal instincts were screaming at me to flee. As I hiked past the area where the men had been, I stopped to examine the ground one last time. And that's when I saw it, the sight that turned my blood to ice. In the soft mud by the creek were the prints of 3 massive wolves. They were perfectly fresh, arranged in a way that suggested 3 large canids had been sitting there motionless for hours. A wave of pure primal fear washed over me. The men, the wolves, were they one and the same? Was my rational, scientific mind playing tricks on me, or had I witnessed something that defied logic? I quickened my pace, breaking into a near run. I had a 5-mile hike back to my truck, which was parked on an old service road. I kept looking over my shoulder, consumed by the feeling that I was being followed. After an hour of frantic hiking, I reached an open ridge that gave me a clear view back into the valley. I stopped, raised my binoculars, and looked back. My heart sank. Down in the valley, about half a mile behind me, were 3 large wolves. They were on my trail, moving at a steady, unhurried pace. They weren't running or acting like predators on a hunt. They were simply following me, keeping a precise distance from one another, just as the 3 men had. One of them, the largest, likely the alpha, lifted its head and looked directly at me as if it knew I was watching. In its eyes, I saw an intelligence, an ancient and incomprehensible consciousness that I had sensed in the silent figures of the men. Now I ran. I ran with everything I had, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. I shed my heavy pack, keeping only a water bottle and my satellite phone. I didn't look back again, but I could feel their presence, a pressure on my back as if their eyes were fixed on me. I don't know how long I ran. Finally, I saw my truck, a metallic glint of safety in the afternoon sun. I have never felt such overwhelming relief. I fell into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and fired up the engine. As I sped away, I caught one last glimpse of them in my rearview mirror. They were standing at the edge of the forest where the trail began, watching me go, their forms like shadows in the fading light. Then one by one they turned and disappeared into the deep woods. I never filed a report. Who would I tell? That I was menaced by 3 men who might have been wolves? They would have thought I was crazy. I am still a biologist, but I look at the wilderness differently now. I've learned that science cannot explain everything. I've learned that the line between man and animal is not as clear as we believe, and I have heard the silence of the wolves. It is not an absence of sound. It is a silence that is full of ancient knowledge, of an intelligence we cannot fathom, and of a secret not meant for human ears. and that silence more than any howl is what echoes in my nightmares. My name is David. I'm a software engineer, and my life is a carefully curated ecosystem of screens and algorithms. Once a year, I unplug from that digital world and drive north to Alaska for a month. It's my reset button. I get in my old, reliable Jeep and hit the roads where civilization gradually fades into the rearview mirror. This past September, I was heading south on the Alaska Highway, making my way back from the Yukon. It had been a long day of driving and fatigue was setting in. I decided that instead of shelling out for a motel, I'd find a quiet spot off the highway and camp for the night. It was better for my budget, and I told myself kept me closer to the nature I'd come to see. Around 7 p.m., I found the perfect spot. A short, unpaved access road branched off the highway and led to a small clearing bordered by a dense forest of spruce and fir. A small creek gurgled nearby. It was peaceful, secluded, and utterly silent. I parked the Jeep and quickly set up my small one-man tent. I was just heating up some dinner on my camp stove when I heard the low rumble of a heavy engine. A big, beat-up pickup truck, rusted in places and loaded with hunting gear, turned off the highway and pulled up next to my Jeep. 2 men got out. They looked like locals, maybe Athabascan. They were probably in their 40s with faces weathered by a lifetime spent outdoors and clothes that were practical and worn. There was a quiet competence about them, a stillness you only see in people who are deeply connected to the land. "Evening," said the taller of the two, his voice a low, calm baritone. "Evening," I replied, a little on guard. I was a city guy, and encounters with strangers in a place this remote always put me on edge. "Figured you'd camp here for the night?" the other man asked. He was shorter but built like a bulldog. "Yeah, just for tonight," I said. Seemed like a quiet spot. The tall man glanced toward the forest, which was now growing dark and inscrutable in the twilight. "This isn't a safe place," he said, his tone flat and matter-of-fact. It wasn't a threat, it was a statement. I gave a little laugh, a bit of urban arrogance showing through. "I mean, I've got my food stored properly, got my bear spray, I'll be careful." The shorter man shook his head slowly, a look of pity on his face. "Bear spray works when you see the bear coming. Some things out here you don't see. Our advice is you move on," the tall man said again. "There's a motel about 20 miles down the road. Stay there." There was a seriousness in his voice that unsettled me, but my own stubbornness, my city-bred pride, kept me from listening. I was tired. I was set up. I wasn't going to pack everything up again because of some local superstition. "I appreciate the advice," I said, trying to sound firm, "but I'll be fine. I've camped in wilder places than this." The 2 men exchanged a look of frustration and maybe a little resignation. The tall one shrugged. "All right, suit yourself, just be smart about it." They got back in their truck, but they didn't leave. They drove about 100 yards down the access road and pulled over into another small clearing. I could see them from my camp. They killed their headlights, and their truck quickly became a large, silent shadow in the growing darkness. Their presence unnerved me. Were they trying to intimidate me? Was this their spot and they were waiting me out? I tried to make sense of it, but eventually I decided to just ignore them. I finished my dinner, doused my fire, and crawled into my tent. I placed my Jeep keys and the can of bear spray right next to my sleeping bag. I tried to sleep, but every sound from the forest, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the wind, now seemed amplified, menacing. It must have been around midnight when a sound jolted me fully awake. It was a deep, guttural breathing, and it was right outside my tent. It was followed by the heavy tread of something massive. This was no squirrel or fox, this was big. My heart hammered against my ribs. I held my breath, not daring to move. Then came the sniffing. a wet, powerful nose pressed against the thin nylon of my tent, inhaling my scent. I could picture it perfectly. A massive grizzly standing just feet away, deciding if the thing inside was worth the effort of tearing through the fabric. Fear paralyzed me. My bear spray was inches away, but I couldn't bring myself to reach for it, terrified that the slightest movement would trigger an attack. I just lay there, my eyes squeezed shut, praying. The animal let out a low growl, a sound that vibrated through my entire body. It placed a paw on the tent and I heard the fabric stretch, groaning under the weight. This is it, I thought. This is how it ends. Suddenly, a blindingly bright light flooded my tent, illuminating it from the inside. It was immediately followed by the deafening blast of a truck horn, its piercing sound shattering the night's silence. There was a terrifying roar from outside my tent, then the sound of heavy paws scrambling, crashing through the underbrush as the animal fled back into the forest. The light and the horn were coming from the truck 100 yards away. Those men, they had saved me. I lay there for several minutes, shaking uncontrollably. The truck's headlights stayed on for a while, a protective beam cutting through the darkness, as if to ensure the danger had passed. Then they switched off, and silence returned. But it was no longer a threatening silence. It felt like a blanket. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, but I was no longer afraid. I was grateful for the silent guardians who had been watching over me in the dark. When the first light of dawn appeared, I cautiously peered out of my tent. The truck was gone. They had left as silently as they had arrived. I walked over to the spot where their truck had been parked. In the damp earth, their tire tracks were clearly visible, but alongside them was something else. Massive paw prints. A bear. They were so large my entire hand could fit inside one. The tracks led toward my camp and then in a chaotic scramble back toward the forest, right from the spot where the truck had stood. It was then that I fully understood. They weren't trying to scare me. They weren't trying to intimidate me. They were warning me of a real, mortal danger. And when I, in my urban ignorance, had refused to listen, they hadn't abandoned me to my fate. They had stayed. They had watched over me, knowing the animal would come. I packed up my camp quickly, my heart filled with a profound sense of gratitude and shame. I thought about the two nameless men who had sacrificed their night's sleep to save a stubborn stranger. That day, I began to see Alaska in a new light. I learned that sometimes the most important warnings are delivered quietly, and the greatest protection comes from those you least expect. Those truckers were my guardian angels that night, there to teach me that in this unforgiving land, humanity and looking out for one another is the ultimate survival tool. December in Alaska isn't just cold, it's a living entity. It's a presence that seeps into your bones, crystallizes your breath in the air, and smothers the world in a silent white dream. And with the cold comes the darkness. A deep, profound darkness that swallows even the few dim hours of daylight. My name is Jacob. I'm an ex-military guy, and I've spent years in places where silence and solitude can be your best friend or your worst enemy. Every winter, I spend a week solo camping in Alaska's Chugach National Forest. It's a pilgrimage of sorts, a test to remind myself that I'm still alive, that I can still face the raw, unforgiving edge of nature. This year, I chose a spot I'd never been to before, a sheltered clearing by a frozen lake, nestled deep within a stand of dense spruce trees. I set up my heavy canvas wall tent, complete with a small wood stove that could keep me from freezing through the long nights. I had plenty of firewood, dry rations, and a satellite phone. I had followed every rule of survival. The first 2 days were serene. I spent my time chopping wood, snowshoeing across the frozen landscape, and listening to the profound quiet that only a winter forest can offer. The nights were long and black, but the warmth of the stove and the flickering glow of my campfire made my small camp feel like a fortress. On the third night, something changed. The sky was overcast, blotting out any light from the moon or stars. The world beyond the small circle of my campfire was absolute, impenetrable black. I was sitting in a camp chair by the fire, nursing a mug of hot tea, listening to the snap and hiss of the burning logs. The air was perfectly still and the falling snow muffled every sound. It was around 10 p.m. when I first heard the footsteps. It was a faint, careful crunch on the dry, frozen snow. I froze, straining my ears. The sound stopped. I told myself it was an animal, a fox, maybe a snowshoe hare. I picked up my tea, but my eyes were fixed on the darkness where the light from my fire died. A few minutes later, the sound came again, closer this time. 2 distinct steps, then a pause, then 3 more and another pause. It wasn't the gait of an animal. Animals move with a purpose or a rhythm. This was deliberate, measured, as if something was aware of me and was either trying not to be heard, or wanted me to know it was there. I slowly rose from my chair and grabbed my rifle, which was leaning against the tent. I didn't chamber a round, but its cold, heavy weight was a comfort in my hands. "Who's out there?" I called out, my voice sounding like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. No answer. I flicked on my powerful headlamp and swept its beam through the trees. The light bounced off the trunks, revealing nothing but more trees and falling snow. I turned it off, letting my night vision return. I sat back down by the fire, but the feeling of peace was gone, replaced by a thrumming tension. Every shadow seemed to take on a shape. Every snap of a twig sounded like a footstep. And then I saw him. He was standing right at the edge of the firelight, at the precise, wavering boundary where the last embers of light surrendered to the darkness. He was a tall, gaunt figure. He wore old, tattered clothes that looked wholly inadequate for the brutal cold. His hair was long and matted, and his face was lost in the shadows. I couldn't see details, only his silhouette. He did nothing. He just stood there, perfectly still, watching me. I could feel his gaze. "Do you need help?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. He didn't answer. He didn't move. I realized he was intentionally staying in the dark. He was refusing to step into the circle of light. It was a game, a psychological battle. He was letting me know he was there, but denying me the ability to truly see him. "If you don't need help, then you need to leave," I said, trying to force authority into my voice. Still, he remained motionless. I picked up my rifle and rested it across my lap, the barrel pointed in his direction. It was an unmistakable message. It had no effect on him. Time stretched on, 10 minutes, 20, half an hour. He stood there, a silent, dark statue. I remained frozen in my chair, my eyes locked on him. The fire was the only barrier between us, a tiny island of light in an ocean of darkness. Then I noticed the fire was dying down. The flames were shrinking and the circle of light was contracting. As the ring of light receded by a foot, the figure took a single step forward. He was still at the very edge of the light, on that razor-thin border between illumination and shadow. His movement was so fluid and silent that if I hadn't been watching, I would have missed it. My heart leaped into my throat. This was no coincidence. He was waiting for the fire to die. He was waiting for the light to end. I scrambled to throw more logs onto the fire. The flames roared back to life and the circle of light expanded. As it did, he took one step back, retreating to the edge of the darkness once more. I understood now. This was a horrifying, predatory game. He was showing me that he was in control. He could approach me whenever he wanted. My survival depended on that fire, and he knew it. I glanced at my woodpile. I didn't have enough to keep the fire blazing like this all night. The next few hours were a grueling ordeal. I fed the fire, and he watched from the darkness. Every time the flames dipped, he would take a step forward. Every time I built them up, he would take a step back. We were locked in a silent, deadly dance. I tried to see his eyes. The shadows made it difficult, but sometimes, when he tilted his head at just the right angle, I caught a glint. They were shining. It was the reflective shine of an animal's eyes, but behind it was an intelligence. A cold, calculating, and utterly inhuman intelligence. Dawn was still hours away. My woodpile was dwindling. My body ached with fatigue, and my mind was frayed from the constant tension and fear. I made a decision. I couldn't play this game on his terms. I raised my rifle and took aim. "This is your last warning," I yelled, my voice raw. "You take one more step and I will shoot." For a moment I thought he had listened. He remained perfectly still. Then a log in the fire crumbled and the flames dipped for a split second. The circle of light shrank, and he took a step forward. I fired. The roar of the rifle shot was deafening, echoing through the forest. The bullet tore through the space where he had been standing. But there was no sound of impact, no cry of pain, no falling body. He was simply gone. As the echo of the gunshot faded, the forest was silent again. But it was a different kind of silence now. It was the silence of emptiness. I flicked on my headlamp and ran to the spot. There were no footprints in the snow but my own. No blood, no body, nothing. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire until dawn, clutching my rifle, watching every shadow with paranoid intensity. When the first weak light of the sun finally broke through the trees, I packed my camp and left. I didn't look back. To this day, I don't know who or what he was. A ghost? The spirit of some long-dead trapper? Or a living man driven mad by the cold and the solitude? But I know one thing. He wasn't just hiding in the darkness. He was the darkness. He lived on that border where the light ends and the fear begins. And that night, he forced me to look across that border. What I saw will stay with me forever. I learned that the greatest horror isn't what you see in the dark. It's what sees you, watching from the edge, just waiting for your light to die. My name is Sarah. I'm a geologist, and my life is spent reading the stories that the earth tells in its rocks and ancient formations. I'm used to solo travel, especially to places where the marks of civilization are faint and the raw power of nature is overwhelming. The Alaskan coast has always held a particular fascination for me. A place where the ocean and mountains collide, and the weather can turn on you in a heartbeat. This October, I was camping on a remote, little-known stretch of beach in Kenai Fjords National Park. To get there, I had chartered a small boat that dropped me on a desolate black sand shore with the promise of a return trip in 2 days. The place was magnificent. On one side, the deep steel blue of the Pacific with the occasional seal or sea otter breaking the surface. On the other, a dense primeval forest that climbed straight up the mountainsides. I pitched my tent just above the high tide line near the edge of the tree line. I set up my gear, collected a few rock samples, and reveled in the profound, soul-deep quiet that only a place like this can offer. The first day was perfect. The sky was clear and the air was a crisp mix of salt and spruce. But in Alaska, the weather is a fickle god, prone to sudden, dramatic shifts in mood. On the afternoon of the second day, I saw it coming. A solid white wall of fog appeared on the horizon, moving in from the sea. This wasn't a gentle mist, it looked alive, like a predator stalking the coastline. Within minutes, it had swallowed everything. The sun vanished, the mountains disappeared, and even the sound of the ocean seemed to muffle and recede. The fog was so dense I couldn't see more than 10 feet from my tent. The world had shrunk to a small, white, and eerily silent room. All around me was a ghostly whiteness, and the muted crash of the waves was now a distant rhythmic whisper. I took refuge in my tent, hoping it would pass quickly. I pulled out a book, but I couldn't focus. There was something unnatural about this fog. It wasn't just water vapor, it felt like a curtain, one that had deliberately cut me off from the rest of the world. Evening began to fall, though it was hard to tell time in the disorienting whiteout. I was sitting in my tent heating soup on my small stove when I first heard the footsteps. It was the sound of someone walking on the wet gravel of the beach, a slow, measured crunching gait. Crunch, crunch, crunch. My heart forgot to beat. I shut off the stove and held my breath, listening. The sound was circling my camp, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. It was the walk of a person, no doubt about it. But who could possibly be out here? The boat captain had told me there wasn't another soul for miles. I summoned my courage, unzipped the tent fly just a crack and peered out. I saw nothing, just the swirling, opaque white, but the footsteps continued, methodically circling the perimeter of my camp as if something were inspecting my tiny territory. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice feeling thick and immediately absorbed by the fog. There was no answer, but the footsteps stopped. A long, agonizing silence descended, broken only by the thumping of my own heart and the muffled rhythm of the waves. I told myself it was my imagination, a trick of the fog and the isolation. I zipped the tent closed and sat back, clutching my hunting knife. Its cold, solid handle was a small, inadequate comfort in my trembling hand. Several minutes passed. Just as I was beginning to believe the danger had passed, I heard it. A faint, dragging sound against the fabric of my tent. It was the sound of a fingertip or something like it, tracing a line along the outside wall. The sound moved slowly, deliberately from one end of the tent to the other. An icy wave of terror washed down my spine. Something was right outside my tent, close enough to touch it. I sat frozen, unable to move. The dragging sound stopped. Then the flap of my tent, which I had zipped shut, twitched. Just a slight pull, as if someone were testing it from the outside. That was it. A surge of adrenaline and fear-fueled anger broke my paralysis. "Get away from me!" I screamed. Gripping my knife, I yanked the zipper open in one violent motion and lunged outside. I said, "Get away!" The words died in my throat. There was no one there. I stood outside my tent, surrounded by the thick white fog. No person, no animal, nothing. I scanned the suffocating whiteness, my eyes trying to pierce the veil. Was I going crazy? Was this all some elaborate hallucination? I was about to turn and retreat back into my tent when my gaze fell to the ground, and my blood ran cold. There in the wet sand and gravel directly outside my tent were footprints. They weren't from boots. They were the prints of bare feet. Long, slender feet that looked human but with an unsettling strangeness. The toes were longer and thinner than normal, and the heel impression was deep, as if the walker's weight was distributed in an unnatural way. The tracks formed a perfect circle around my tent. They stopped at the spot where I now stood, and then they continued on, away from the shore, leading directly into the fog-shrouded forest. I stared at the prints, trying to process what I was seeing. They were wet, as if the walker had just emerged from the sea. Shaking, I followed the tracks for a few feet. They were clear for a few steps, and then they simply vanished into the fog, as if the person who made them had dissolved into the air. I scrambled back to my tent, dove inside, and zipped it shut, piling my gear against the entrance as a makeshift barricade. I didn't sleep that night. I sat bolt upright, startled by every sound. My mind replaying the footsteps and the touch on the tent, I kept imagining the barefoot figure standing out there in the fog, watching me, silently waiting for me to emerge again. Who was it? Or what was it? The ghost of a drowned sailor? Or some creature of the coast, one that emerges only when the fog provides it cover? The next morning, the fog had thinned but not cleared, leaving the world wrapped in a gray, melancholic light. I peered outside. The footprints were still there, slightly blurred by a light overnight drizzle, but still horribly, undeniably real. I packed my gear with frantic speed. I tried to call the boat captain on my satellite phone, but there was no signal. I would have to wait for his scheduled arrival. Those few hours were the longest of my life. I stood on the beach, my eyes glued to the sea, praying for the sight of the boat. I didn't dare look toward the forest. I was afraid that if I did, I would see a tall, slender figure standing at the edge of the fog, waiting. When I finally heard the drone of the boat's engine, I nearly wept with relief. I grabbed my things and ran toward the water. The captain, a weathered old seaman, saw the terror on my face. "Everything all right, miss?" he asked as I climbed aboard. I told him about the footsteps. He took a long, slow breath and looked back at the shore. "There are stories about this coast," he said, his voice low. "Old stories. The Tlingit elders say that when the fog rolls in, the sea sends back its drowned. They wander the shores looking for their old homes, but all they find are strangers." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and deep-seated belief. "You're lucky," he said. "You're lucky all you saw were the footprints. I'm still a geologist, but I never camp alone on the coast anymore. And whenever a thick fog rolls in, even in the city, I remember that feeling. The feeling that something is on the other side of the veil, walking silently, waiting to get just a little bit closer. I remember the sound of wet, bare feet on gravel, and I know that some things come from the fog and they should be left in the fog." My name is Leo. I'm a field recordist. My job is to capture the sounds of the world that most people will never hear. I've recorded the grumble of volcanoes, the deep groan of calving glaciers, and the complex symphonies of rainforests. My obsession is acoustic ecology, the study of how a place's soundscape reflects its character and health. My ultimate goal has always been the pursuit of pure silence, a location so devoid of man-made noise that you can hear the planet itself breathing. This search led me to one of the most remote and inaccessible regions of Alaska, a valley with no name on any map, known among the few bush pilots who had flown over it only as the Still Valley. The lore was that the place was so quiet you could hear the blood moving through your own veins. For me, it was the ultimate prize, the potential masterpiece of my career. I chartered a small bush plane that dropped me on a frozen lake near the valley's entrance. The moment the pilot cut the engine to help me unload, I felt it, a silence that was almost solid. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was a heavy, pressing quiet that weighed on your eardrums. "Same time in 3 days," the pilot said, his voice sounding like a sacrilege in the stillness. "If you haven't gone mad by then." He tried to smile, but his eyes were uneasy. As the plane took off and its drone faded, the silence descended on me like a physical presence. I looked around. The valley was narrow and deep, flanked by sheer walls of gray rock that squeezed the sky into a narrow ribbon. The ground was a thick, flawless blanket of snow. There were no trees, no shrubs, just snow and rock. The air was perfectly, unnervingly still. I set up my camp, a small 4-season tent. Then I unpacked my most precious equipment, my sound recording gear. I set up 2 ultra-sensitive omnidirectional microphones on a special stand, designed to capture frequencies far beyond the range of the human ear. I connected them to my digital recorder and put on my studio-quality headphones. When I hit record and listened to the world through the headphones, I was stunned. I could hear the sound of my own breathing amplified to a gale. I could hear my own heartbeat, a steady, deep drum. I could hear the faint rustle of my parka as I shifted my weight. These were sounds normally lost in the background noise of existence, but here, they were a symphony. I recorded for hours. I captured the faint tinkling of ice crystals forming as the temperature dropped. I heard the distant fall of a single small rock from a peak which echoed like a cannon shot in the silence. These were the pure primordial sounds I had been searching for. I was in heaven. The first night passed peacefully. I slept in my tent, enveloped in a quiet so profound it felt deeper than any noise. The next day, I moved my microphones to a more central location in the valley, wanting to capture the room tone of the place itself. I started the recording and walked back to my camp, a good distance away, so my own presence wouldn't interfere. Hours later, as the dim twilight of the Arctic afternoon began to fade, I returned to retrieve my gear. I put on the headphones and rewound the recording to listen. At first, it was just those pure sounds, the almost inaudible whisper of the wind, the faint crackle of the snow. It was hypnotic. I closed my eyes, losing myself in the soundscape. Then, about an hour into the recording, I heard something else. It was a whisper. It was so faint that if I hadn't been concentrating, I would have missed it. It sounded like it was right next to my ears, inside the headphones. "It's getting cold." My heart stopped. That was my own thought. I had thought that exact phrase just before I started the recording as a chill wind had brushed my face. The voice had echoed my thought, but it wasn't my voice. It was dry, toneless, and cold, like a machine learning to speak. I ripped the headphones off, my heart pounding. I scanned the valley. There was no one. I was utterly alone for miles. It was impossible. A radio interference? A malfunction in my gear? I checked all my connections. Everything was perfect. With trembling hands, I put the headphones back on and fast-forwarded the recording. After a few minutes of silence, the voice came again. "This place feels so empty." Another thought, one that had drifted through my mind as I had surveyed the vast barren landscape. The voice repeated it verbatim in the same flat, emotionless tone. The fear was real now, coiling in my gut. This wasn't a technical glitch. This was something else, something incomprehensible. I kept listening, like a person unable to look away from a horror movie. Every few minutes, the voice would return, echoing a random, fleeting thought I'd had. "I hope the pilot comes back on time. These rocks look ancient. Did I zip the tent properly?" It was as if the valley itself were a giant microphone, one that was recording not sound but my own consciousness. It was absorbing my thoughts and playing them back to me as a soulless echo. Terrified, I packed up my gear and scrambled back to my camp. I sealed myself inside my tent, but no place felt safe anymore. My own mind had become the enemy. I was afraid to think, terrified that the voice would catch the thought and broadcast it back to me, turning it into a horrifying reality. I tried to sleep, but my mind was racing. Every thought was a potential echo. "What's out there?" I thought, a spike of fear shooting through me. And then from just outside the tent, carried on the still air, I heard it without the headphones. "What's out there?" I screamed. I clamped my hands over my ears, but the voice was already inside my head. The silence of this place wasn't empty. It was a vacuum, a hungry void that absorbed everything that entered. It, sound, light, and now, thought. It was an echoing chamber that reflected back the darkest parts of your own psyche. The last night was an agony of self-inflicted torture. I tried to stop thinking, to empty my mind, but it's impossible. Every stray thought, every flicker of fear, every memory was caught and played back to me in a cold, judgmental whisper. "You're all alone. No one can help you. You're going insane." When the first weak light of dawn broke, I stumbled out of the tent, my eyes red-rimmed with terror and sleeplessness. I didn't pack my gear. I left everything, my priceless equipment, my tent, all of it. I ran to the frozen lake where the pilot was supposed to meet me. I sat there for hours on the ice, oblivious to the cold, just staring at the sky. I tried to keep my mind as blank as possible, repeating mantras, counting numbers, anything to keep from forming new thoughts. When I finally heard the distant drone of the plane, it was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The pilot saw the look on my face in the abandoned camp behind me. He didn't ask any questions. He just knew. On the flight back, as we passed over the valley, I looked down. It looked serene, silent, and immaculate, as if nothing had ever happened. I quit field recording after that. I can't stand the quiet anymore. Whenever a room gets too silent, I feel a rising panic, a fear that I'll hear my own thoughts whispered back at me. I never deleted the recordings from the valley. They are locked away on a hard drive, a digital tomb. Sometimes, on my darkest nights, I listen to them. And every time I hear something new, the echoes of other thoughts from other people who must have come before me. Prospectors, hunters, hikers, their fears, their hopes, their madness, all preserved in the silence. That valley is a library, but it collects souls, not books. And its silence, its hungry, echoing silence, still resounds in my mind. My name is Ethan. I'm a wanderer, a man who finds solace at the frayed edges of the map. I've spent most of my life seeking out places where the human footprint is faint and the sky is vast. I've known the silence of deserts and the solitude of mountains, but the Alaskan tundra, that's something else entirely. It's a land that reminds you just how ancient, expansive, and indifferent the world truly is. This past September, I was on a solo trek through the vast plains of the Noatak National Preserve, one of the largest undisturbed wilderness areas on Earth. There are no roads, no trails, and no facilities. You are simply at the mercy of the elements. On the fourth day of my journey, I saw it. I had been hiking for miles across a flat, snow-dusted tundra. All around me, the ground stretched out like a white, featureless sheet, meeting a gray sky at the horizon. But ahead, about half a mile away, was a dark patch in the white. As I got closer, its shape became clear. It was a perfect circle of earth, about 50 feet in diameter, completely devoid of snow. The ground around it was covered in a thick, frozen layer, but this circle was as if it had been meticulously swept clean. The earth was a deep, dark brown, and a faint steam was rising from it, visible in the frigid air. I stood at the edge of the circle, baffled and intrigued. This wasn't any geological feature I recognized. It wasn't a hot spring. There was no water, no smell of sulfur. It didn't look like a meteorite impact crater. It was too smooth, too perfect. Carefully, I took off my glove and knelt, pressing my hand to the ground. It was warm. Not a burning heat, but a living, pulsing warmth, like touching the flank of a great animal. I snatched my hand back, a jolt of unease running through me. My scientific mind scrambled for explanations. Subterranean volcanic activity? A deposit of radioactive minerals? But no theory could account for the perfect geometry and the strange organic warmth of the place. My curiosity overrode my apprehension. I decided to make camp nearby. I had to see what happened at night. I pitched my tent about 100 yards from the circle, making sure I was at what I considered a safe distance. As the sun set and a long blue twilight fell over the tundra, I cooked my meal, my eyes constantly drawn to the dark circle. In the dimming light, it looked like a black hole, a wound in the earth. I retreated to my tent, but I couldn't sleep. My mind raced, trying to solve the puzzle of the circle, its heat, its shape, its mystery. It must have been around midnight when I heard the sound. It was a low, deep hum. It was at such a low frequency that I felt it in my chest more than I heard it with my ears. It was coming from the direction of the dark circle. I cautiously peered out of my tent. The circle was still there, dark and silent, but the hum was in the air, a steady, rhythmic pulse. The sound felt both mechanical, like a colossal engine running deep underground, and organic, like the breathing of a gargantuan creature. I listened for hours. The hum didn't change, didn't stop. It just continued, filling the vast silence of the tundra with an inexplicable energy. Eventually, exhaustion won and I fell asleep to the sound of that strange terrestrial lullaby. And I dreamed. It was no ordinary dream. It was so vivid, so real that I can still feel it today. I was no longer Ethan, a human. I was something else, a disembodied consciousness floating high above a landscape that was not Alaska. It was a primordial world. The sky was a strange color, and the air was thick with gases I couldn't name. And below, on the surface, they moved. They were colossal beings. They had no discernible shape. They were like living geometry, shifting, mobile shadows the size of mountains. They didn't walk on the land but glided over it, and the earth itself seemed to tremble as they passed. I could feel their alien thoughts, their cold hunger, their incomprehensible scale. They were the masters of this world, and I heard their sound. It was the same hum, the same low rhythmic pulse, but now magnified 1,000,000 times. It was their language, their breath, the very sound of their existence. I woke up with a scream, my body drenched in sweat despite the freezing cold inside the tent. The hum was still there, but it was no longer just a sound. It was a memory, an echo of the dream. The next day was an agony of exhaustion and fear. My mind was reeling with the images from the dream. I thought about leaving, but I couldn't. I had to know. The second night, the hum was louder. As soon as I fell asleep, I was back in the dream. This time, I was closer to the beings. I could see their skin, a texture like living rock. I could see their thousands of eyes, glittering like constellations. I watched as they fed, drawing energy directly from the soil and rock. And I watched as they prepared for slumber, burrowing deep into the earth's crust, entombing themselves for eons, waiting for the world to become hospitable for them once more. I woke up trembling. I understood now. The dark circle was not a geological anomaly. The warmth was not volcanic, it was breath. It was the breathing hole for something sleeping deep beneath the earth. One of the creatures from my dream, so vast and ancient that the human mind could not grasp its scale. The hum was its snore. The warmth was its body heat. A tidal wave of pure terror washed over me. I was camped on the head of a sleeping god. I had to leave. Immediately. I began to pack my gear, my hands shaking so badly I could barely fasten the straps on my pack. I didn't dare look at the circle. As I was cinching the last strap, the hum changed. It was no longer a steady rhythm. It became erratic, like someone stirring from a deep sleep. Then, for a single heart-stopping moment, it stopped, completely. The sound that followed is forever burned into my soul. It was a click, a sharp cracking sound like a colossal eyelid sealed shut for millions of years had just snapped open. I dropped everything and ran. I ran for my life, sprinting across the frozen tundra, not daring to look back. I felt a vast, unseen eye watching me, studying my tiny, insignificant form. I don't know how long I ran. I only stopped when I collapsed from exhaustion into the snow. When I finally dared to look back, I could see the dark circle in the distance. It was still there, silent and motionless. But now, above it, the air shimmered as if distorted by a powerful heat, as if something unseen had risen much closer to the surface. I continued my journey, and 2 days later I stumbled into the first signs of human civilization. I never told anyone what happened. What would they think? That I had gone mad? I still hike, but I don't look at the land the same way anymore. When I see a vast, empty plain, I can't help but wonder what sleeps beneath it. Sometimes at night, when it's very quiet, if I hold my breath and listen, I think I can still hear the hum. A very, very low pulse coming from the deep places of the earth. And I remember that we are not the masters of this world. We are just insects crawling on its surface, blissfully unaware of the things that slumber beneath our feet, waiting for their turn to awaken. My name is Mark. For the last 10 years, I've been a park ranger in the Yukon. My job is to watch over the vast wild spaces that have, so far, remained mostly untouched by the modern world. It's a solitary life, but I love it. I find peace in the silence of the forest, the majesty of the mountains, and the humbling sense that you're a small part of a world much older and grander than yourself. This summer, I was handed a new assignment. The department had decided to reopen the Golden Stair Trail, a 70-kilometer path originally blazed by prospectors during the Klondike Gold Rush. For the last 50 years, it had been officially closed, left to be reclaimed by nature. The official reason for its closure was budget cuts and maintenance difficulties. But all of us rangers knew the old stories. In the 1970s, a series of mysterious disappearances had occurred on the trail. Over a 5-year period, 7 people, all experienced hikers and hunters, walked onto that path and were never seen again. No traces, no bodies, no gear. They vanished as if the earth had simply swallowed them. After the incidents, the trail was deemed unsafe and permanently closed. Now, 50 years later, the department wanted to bury those old ghost stories and promote tourism. My job was to be the first one through. I was to hike the entire trail, assess its condition, flag any potential hazards, and write a detailed report upon my return. It was a week-long solo trek. I set out with all the standard preparations. Top-of-the-line gear, enough rations for 10 days, a satellite phone, and a powerful .44 Magnum holstered at my hip. I parked my truck at the trailhead and stepped onto the overgrown path. The first few hours were perfectly normal. The trail was narrow and choked with vegetation in places, but it was navigable. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the sound of birdsong filled the air. It felt like any other Yukon trail. The first strange thing happened around noon. I had stopped in a small clearing to drink some water. When I started walking again, I heard the sound of a footstep behind me. I spun around instantly, my hand going to my bear spray. But there was nothing there. I dismissed it as an echo, my own footfall bouncing off the nearby rock faces. I continued on, but with a heightened sense of awareness. And that's when I noticed it clearly, the sound of my footsteps. They weren't fading. Normally, when you walk, the sound of each step is made and then it's gone. But not here. Here, the sound of each crunch of gravel under my boot, each rustle of dry leaves would occur and then linger in the air like a faint, ghostly echo. As I kept walking, these echoes began to accumulate. A procession of my own past footsteps was forming behind me. It was like I was being followed by an army of my own ghosts. The feeling was deeply, profoundly unsettling. I would stop and the phantom procession would stop with me. I'd start again and they would fall in line behind me. I tried to rationalize it as some kind of unique acoustic phenomenon, a trick of the valley's geography. But my gut, honed by years in the wilderness, was screaming that this was not normal. The first night I made camp by a creek. The moment I stopped walking, the footsteps ceased and the familiar silence of the woods returned. I felt a sliver of relief, but the unease lingered. The next day, the moment I stepped back onto the path, the sounds began again. A growing, whispering chorus of my own steps. By midday, it got worse. Within the chorus, I began to hear other footsteps. They weren't mine. They were different, some lighter, some heavier, some with a quick pace, some with a slow, weary shuffle. They were the steps of people in different kinds of footwear. They were the steps of those who had walked this path before me. Now, I wasn't just being followed by the echoes of my own progress, but by a phantom crowd marching silently along with me. I could feel their presence at my back, a cold psychic pressure. Fear took hold. The stories, the missing people. Were these their steps? I tried to run, but that only made it worse. The sound of my frantic pounding feet just added to the cacophony, and the phantom army behind me quickened its pace to match. I stopped, gasping for breath, and they all stopped with me. I understood then. The path, it remembered. It recorded the sound of every footstep that ever fell upon it. It was a tape recorder made of dirt and rock and time. The third night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake in my tent, and for the first time I heard the sounds even in camp. They were no longer confined to the trail. They were circling my tent, the restless, soundless tread of dozens, maybe hundreds of different feet. I tried to use my satellite phone to contact headquarters, but there was no signal. I was trapped in this valley with the echoes. On the fourth day, I saw an old, rotting wooden sign, barely legible, nailed to a tree. It read, "Do not go on." It wasn't a department sign. It was handmade. But I couldn't go back. Going back meant walking through the ever-growing crowd of footsteps again. I held on to the desperate hope that if I could just finish the trail, it would end. As I pushed forward, the sounds grew louder, more defined. I could hear more than just footsteps now. I could hear the swish of fabric, a muffled cough, and occasionally a long, weary sigh. It was as if the layers of time were collapsing on top of each other, and I was walking through the middle of it all. On the fifth day, I reached the highest point of the trail, a rocky ridge known as the Devil's Spine. Here, the sound of the footsteps was at its peak, a terrifying, chaotic noise, like hundreds of people running in a panic. And that's when I saw him. Standing in the middle of the path was a human figure. He was translucent, ghostly, but I could see him clearly. He looked like a hiker from the 1970s, complete with a vintage external frame backpack. His face was a mask of pure terror, and he was pointing down the trail, toward a dark, dense section of forest where the path descended. As I approached, he vanished, but the sound of his final silent footstep joined the cacophony behind me. I knew now where the path was leading me. It was leading me to the same place everyone else had gone. This wasn't a trail, it was a trap. It replayed its memories, luring each new traveler toward the same fate as the last. I entered the final stretch of the path, which cut through the dense forest. Here, the sunlight barely reached the ground, and the air was cold and damp. The sound of the footsteps had become a roar, an echo that was vibrating inside my own skull. The trail ended in a small, circular clearing. The clearing was utterly silent. For a moment, I thought it was over. The footsteps had stopped. I breathed a sigh of relief. But then I looked at the ground. There was no grass, no vegetation, just soft, dark earth. And pressed into that earth were thousands upon thousands of footprints overlapping, all leading in one direction, toward the very center of the clearing. And in the center, there was nothing. Just the earth. I took a step forward, and my boots sank into the soft soil. And at that exact moment, behind me, at the entrance to the clearing, a new footstep sounded, a fresh, clear echo. It was the echo of my own step, now a permanent part of the path's memory. A wave of terror unlike anything I had ever known washed over me. I tried to turn, to run, but my feet were stuck, held fast by the clinging soil, as if the ground itself had taken hold of me. The crowd of footsteps started up again behind me, this time moving toward me, pressing me forward, urging me toward the center of the clearing. I could feel the phantom shapes around me, their cold presence, their silent desperation. The last thing I saw was my own footprints joining the thousands of others, all pointing toward the same silent end. Headquarters sent a search party a week later. They found my truck at the trailhead. They found my pack and my rifle in the small clearing at the end of the path. But they found no trace of me. My disappearance was filed away as another unexplained event on the Golden Stair Trail. They decided never to reopen it. But sometimes, when the wind is just right, rangers working in the nearby valleys swear they can hear a faint sound drifting from that abandoned trail. It's a never-ending ghostly echo, the sound of thousands of footsteps, forever walking. And among them there is one new set of prints, mine.